Well, hello students and parents. I wanted to give you an overview of kind of what we talked about here at Collide. For those of you that missed, we hope to see you back next week. But we had a great crowd here where we were able to have some great time together in fellowship, where we were able to dance and to sing and to sweat, in fact, as we gathered together and just had a great time. But more importantly, what we did tonight is we went into the second chapter of Ruth, and we discussed the provision that God begins to provide for Ruth as she aligns her life with Him. And we get to see a really deep explanation of Boaz and really his character as a follower of Christ. We see that Ruth finds herself in the field of Boaz, gleaning off of the leftover barley. And Boaz notices her out in the field and he calls for her. And in fact, he then goes on to bless her by allowing her to stay in the field. He tells her to stay with the girls that are already in that field, to stay close to them and to learn. But also he tells the men to leave her alone. And in fact, he tells the men to leave her some extra there. And then he even invites her over to the table where all the harvesters are, and she eats the bread and the wine vinegar that's there, and they share together. And so we get to see a couple character traits about Boaz and about Ruth. One, we get to see that they're both aligning their lives with God, and because of that, we see God giving them provision and keeping them secure in His field. Second, we get to see that Boaz and Ruth are compassionate. We see that their compassion is for others. For Ruth, it's for Naomi, as she cares for her mother-in-law that's lost her husband and her two sons. For Boaz, we see his compassion for Ruth and for the way in which he blesses her, even though she doesn't deserve it. We see his grace is sufficient in her life. Then we get to see the fact that they're both humble. Ruth doesn't just expect him to bless him. She's humble and she puts her face to the ground when he does. For Boaz, he invites her over to the table and they sit together. He brings them over to the harvester table, even though she had no place there. He was not afraid of the humiliation because he knew where this girl had come from. And she knew of her need, and the Lord had opened that door for him. And lastly, we got to see that they both worked diligently. Boaz, obviously owning a field, has lots of provision there. But even when we look into Ruth's life, we see that she worked in verse 7 from morning until night. She only took a short break under the shelter. See, God was giving provision for her, but she couldn't just sit back on the sidelines and expect for it to come. She had to go, and she had to get that provision. She had to be in the field where God was. She had to be where God was providing. And so our challenge for the students tonight was simply that we would live a life that replicates what Ruth and Boaz showed us tonight in chapter 2. And that ultimately our lives as Christians would not look like the world, but that we would live a life that would demand a gospel explanation.